I read 39 kind of business self-help books in the year of 2022. So in this video, I'm gonna break down my top 5 books in 2022, and then we're gonna go over how I track everything in Notion, just to give you a little hint of like how I do it. And then finally, we're gonna go over some books I'm super excited for 2023. If you're new here, I'm Liz. I'm a data science manager at Intel, but in my free time, I like to film videos on books, self-help, kind of goal setting, planning, all that stuff. So if you're into that, feel free to subscribe. Otherwise, let's jump into it. Starting off with number 1 is called Don't Trust Your Gut. Now, this book was so good. It's basically this guy who is a data scientist, and he goes through and looks at a ton of data about questions that you want to know. So kind of like more human questions like, okay, how do I get more swipes on a dating app? So he would look through all this data and say, you know what, actually looks matter a lot more than you think. And just other really weird niche things that I just kept turning the page and was like, oh my God, it's so fascinating. So the questions he answered was like, what makes you the most happiest? What industry should you start a business in that make the most money? And then kind of what city you should raise your kids in based on data. And that's kind of why I like it, because I am, kind of data mindset here because I'm a data science manager. But it was just like, and he did it and he was funny. He was funny too. So it was just like the smoothest read and just so fascinating. And I talked about it the most to the most people this year, so that is why I'm ranking it number 1. Okay, coming in at number 2 is Happier Hour by Cassie Holmes. Okay, this book was so good. So I actually made a dedicated video on it because I really enjoyed this book, but it'll come out in a couple weeks. But basically she has you time track all your hours for a week and rank the happiness of them, and then use that data in order to craft a perfect weekly schedule. Anyway, it was phenomenal. You need to read it. It was so good. Okay, coming in at number 3 is How I Built This. This is the old cover of the book. That's when I originally purchased. It's really ugly. I hate the cover of this book. It's so good. It's about basically a bunch of companies. He almost does a little breakdown of how bad companies started out. So for example, Airbnb, they put a bunch of stuff on credit cards, and it's just the background story behind some of the largest companies, and you're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea they struggled that much. And it makes you feel so much better about your business and your life, because you're like, at least I'm not making those mistakes. But it was just a really good read if you're into entrepreneurship or business and stuff like that. Okay, number 4, this is the Minimalist Entrepreneur. Now this is the guy who actually invented Gumroad or founded Gumroad, which is where you can sell digital products online, which I actually post products on Gumroad, so I thought it was kind of funny. But this book, he's really funny, and he talks about how you don't need a bunch of fancy stuff to basically build a company. So he's like, just try it out, do the minimal viable product, like MVP, and just throw something together. And it's just very inspiring, because it was like, oh, you don't need much. He also recommends using Notion as far as operations, so I started doing that as well. And lastly, we have the Common Path to Uncommon Success. Okay, it has a terrible title. I can never remember the title of this freaking book. It's the guy who has this podcast called Engineers on Fire. He has a really popular podcast, and this I feel like is the most underrated book. It was so good. Terrible name. I know no one picks it up and no one talks about it because it's freaking gray and it's got the worst name of life. But I will tell you, super good book. Talks about how he started his podcast and all the things that we struggle with as creators, in the sense of, oh my gosh, I'm not ready to publish, and how he had cold feet after he did all this work. And it was just super relatable, and then also gave really good tips on when to post things. I just thought it was a phenomenal read for anyone who wants to start a YouTube channel or starting this whole creator thing. It was really good. So I'm putting that as my number 5. Okay, so I kind of want to pull up my Notion here, because this is how I track books in Notion. So if you look here, these are all my books. Now I like to give them a rating. So my top 5 obviously got the highest rating, but they're all color coordinated, and they go in a database with my other books. But what I love about it is I will open up a book like this one. I'll usually tag what topics it is and then give it a rating, but then I have all these notes, and then I link to other books. So you can see in, Happier Hour by Cassie Holmes, she talked about humor seriously. She talked about designing your work life, or at least somebody who wrote that book. I would read it and be like, oh my gosh, I know that person. That person wrote another book. So that is what I like to do. I like to take lots of notes, paste them in here. I even made my own weekly schedule and put that in there. Honestly, just such a good book in general. But that is kind of what I like to do. I like to do a gallery view And then I also have it by rating. So these are all the books I read this year. And then you can see obviously the top 5 or the ones that I'm recommending to you here. And then I have, 4-star, which is like almost amazing, like close to amazing, but like they're not amazing, I'm kind of strict when it comes to books. Like you have to really like change my life in order to get a good rating. I have a calendar view, table view. I like to track who recommends them too. So I have a couple people in here, a lot from Ali Abdaal. So I like to track that, and then obviously a Kanban board, whether I'm done with them or whatever. But that's kind of my strategy. I try to keep it simple. I know this seems complex, but it's simple, right? Like each card is a book. It's not complicated. And then you type the notes. I just underline in the book and then I extract them. It's kind of annoying because you have to manually extract them, but I like to read physical books and then I like to digitize the notes. Okay, future books in 2023. The first one I'm super excited for is called The Pathless Path. Now, this one is the #1 recommended book from Ali Abdaal. Now, cool thing is the author actually sent this to me and then wrote a nice little note. I was like so excited to see that. Like the fact that he sent me it and then he wrote like, keep going for the YouTube channel. Like I'm super excited. I'm going to film a whole video on this one. I haven't started it yet. It's so crisp, so clean. I can't wait to fold that page back, but I'm like, I will keep this book for the rest of my life. The next book I'm actually almost done with. It's called The Untethered Soul. Now this was recommended by Elizabeth Phillips, and she is more of like, I like artsy and philosophy and stuff. And she recommended this book saying like, oh my gosh, it's just so good. It helps you control your emotions. And I know I need that. So I'm going to finish this book and probably in early 2023. So I'm super excited for this one. And lastly, we have how do we know ourselves? So I picked this book up in New York. I'm really excited for it. It's how your environment kind of shapes you. So there's a chapter on like your birth order matters and other things like that I'm like, oh, that sounds fascinating. So I'm super excited to read this one. This one definitely won't be read until like late January. Now this should give you a good idea of what books you should be reading in 2023 or which ones like you won't regret. Because I know people who will recommend like a bunch of books and I'm like, no, I want your top 5, like your top 1. I want to know exactly which one is like gonna change my life. So honestly, you can't go wrong with the 5 that I recommended. Even the 3 that I'm looking forward to, I have a feeling they're gonna be really good. So they might end up in the list for next year, but I will link my review on Happier Hour somewhere up here when it gets posted, because I think it's gonna come out like a couple weeks after this one. But who knows, maybe I'll be on top of it. But otherwise, I will see you guys next time.